June 4th, 1943, Railroad Street, Mexia, Texas. The night air carried a hum of electricity, the kind that signaled not just power, but civilization itself. Inside a Pullman car, a pencil trembled in the hand of Unteroffizier Werner Burkhardt as he wrote in his hidden diary. The entry was forbidden. If his German officers had discovered it, punishment would have been immediate. Yet he wrote anyway. The Americans must be lying to us. No nation could possess such abundance while fighting a war on two fronts. Outside his train window stretched a vision that no propaganda from Berlin could explain. Every house along the Texas plains glowed with light electric light, blazing steadily from porches, barns, and even roadside billboards that shimmered in the humid air. The train's steel wheels clattered past a landscape alive with motion cars on paved roads, neon signs advertising diners still open at 10 p.m., and farmhouses that shimmered like constellations across the dark horizon. To a man from wartime Germany, it was a hallucination. Back home, blackout orders had plunged the Reich into darkness since 1940. In rural Bavaria or Saxony, fewer than 1 in 5 farms even had electrical power. But here, even the smallest towns burned bright against the night, as if energy itself were infinite. That was the first fracture in the worldview of 1-850 soldiers from General Erwin Rommel's famed Africa Corps, who stepped off that train in Mexia, Texas. Not cattle cars, not freight wagons. Passenger coaches clean-cushioned and served by dining cars that still smelled of coffee and butter. For men who had marched across the Sahara and fought in the burning dunes of El Alamein, the softness of that ride felt unreal. The townspeople of Mexia had gathered in silence to watch their arrival, enemy soldiers in immaculate desert uniforms, faces gaunt from months of hunger, now being escorted not into misery, but into order. What none of them knew was that this quiet night in Texas would mark the beginning of one of the most extraordinary psychological transformations in modern history, the demolition of Nazi ideology through the evidence of American abundance. The collapse had begun weeks earlier, on May 13, 1943, in Tunisia. There, General Jürgen von Arnim Rommel's successor surrendered his army 250,000 men to the Allies. It was the largest capitulation of German forces since Stalingrad. Among them were some of Germany's most hardened veterans' tank crews who had once driven the British to the gates of Egypt, and infantrymen decorated with the Iron Cross. One of them was Hauptmann Friedrich Radke, a career officer wounded twice in North Africa. His diary, found decades later in the U.S. National Archives, would reveal what few historians had understood, that the German defeat in the desert was not just military. It was ideological. Radke and 30,000 other prisoners began their journey in the Algerian port of Oran. The camps there, hastily built and dust-choked, were the first cracks in the illusion of German superiority. Even in chaos, the Americans processed prisoners with mechanical precision. Each man photographed, registered, medically examined, inoculated. Each name filed under a system that seemed to function like clockwork. It wasn't kindness that shocked them, it was efficiency. German soldiers who had worshipped discipline now saw it executed by an enemy they had been told was lazy and undisciplined. American officers spoke fluent German. They handed out Red Cross forms, explained rights under the Geneva Convention, and did so without shouting, without beating, without fear. To the Germans accustomed to the brutality of their own command, this calm authority was unnerving. And then came the food. Obergefreiter Hans Mühr, captured with the 21st Panzer Division, wrote months later to his mother in Hamburg, "In Oran, we were fed better in a week than in 6 months of desert fighting. White bread, real coffee, meat twice a day. We thought it was propaganda. Then we realized it was simply how they ate." That realization spread like fire through the camps. For men raised under a regime that preached scarcity and sacrifice, the Americans seemed to live in another world, one where food and fuel flowed endlessly. Every detail was an insult to Nazi propaganda. The Germans had been taught that America was decadent, disorganized, collapsing under the weight of immigrants and capitalism. But in captivity, they found a machine vast, ordered, and generous. When the Liberty ships arrived to transport them across the Atlantic, another layer of disbelief took hold. The ship that carried Radke, the SS Robert E. Peary, had been built in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes at the Kaiser shipyards in Richmond, California. 4 days. In Berlin, engineers would have laughed at such a claim. A cargo vessel that normally required months of construction had been completed before the paint could dry, and it wasn't an anomaly. At peak production, American shipyards launched 3 Liberty ships every day. Each of them required 250,000 individual parts drawn from factories across 32 states, a choreography of production unlike anything Germany could achieve. Even Britain, with all its naval experience, could not match it. What the prisoners were beginning to see was what economists would later call the economics of scale, the weapon that won the war. America had not only mobilized its army, it had mobilized its entire society. The crossing itself became a 2-week lesson in industrial excess. The prisoners watched in silence as American sailors threw away half-eaten steaks, whole loaves of bread, gallons of milk that had soured overnight. Feldwebel Kurt Zimmermann of the 90th Light Division wrote, "They threw food overboard not to mock us, but because it meant nothing. Their supply was endless." That simple observation was more devastating than any Allied propaganda leaflet. Germany had built an ideology on scarcity, on the idea that only the strong deserved abundance. Yet here was a society that gave freely, wastefully even, and still had more than it needed. Zimmermann concluded, "They fight with the power of a nation that knows hunger only as a word." When the Robert E. Peary approached the American coast, Lieutenant Colonel Wilhelm von Stober, a Prussian aristocrat and lifelong soldier, stood on deck and stared at a spinning radar antenna above the bridge. Radar standard equipment on a cargo ship. To the Germans, radar had been a top-secret wonder weapon produced only in small quantities and reserved for elite units. Yet here it was rotating quietly above a merchant vessel. In that moment, he later wrote, "I understood that Germany had already lost the war." The shock was not only technological, it was existential. As the ship entered Norfolk Naval Base, Virginia, the prisoners fell silent. Before them stretched docks that seemed to go on forever. Steel cranes, assembly lines, and convoys of trucks moving in perfect rhythm. In one day, the port of Norfolk handled more cargo than Hamburg could in a week. Radke wrote, "We were defeated not by armies but by production. For the 850 men bound for Texas, the next stage of their journey would deepen that revelation. The trains waiting for them were not cattle wagons, but Pullman passenger coaches, complete with dining cars and sleeping berths. They boarded like tourists, not prisoners." An American sergeant, embarrassed by the comfort, apologized. "Sorry, fellas, air conditioning's out in this one." Air conditioning. In August, for men who had fought in 120-degree desert heat, the phrase itself felt like science fiction. Through the windows, as the trains rolled westward, they saw small towns glowing with neon lights, factories running through the night, and endless rail lines stretching toward a horizon powered by abundance. Every mile of that journey chipped away at the foundation of Nazi ideology. They had been told America was decadent. They were discovering it was divine. As dawn broke over Virginia on August 3, 1943, the first convoys of German prisoners began the long journey into the heart of the United States. From Norfolk Naval Base to the rail yards beyond, they were marched in formation, uniforms, crisp boots, polished discipline intact, but inside confusion and disbelief churned. They had entered the industrial bloodstream of a nation that by 1943 had become the engine of the modern world. Norfolk itself sprawled across more than 4,000 acres, cranes and gantries rising above the harbor like cathedrals of steel. In a single day, this one port loaded and unloaded more tonnage than Hamburg or Bremen could process in a week. Everywhere the prisoners looked, machines moved in perfect synchronization. Electric cranes lifted containers effortlessly gliding along tracks that seemed to stretch into infinity. Diesel trucks hummed across the docks, headlights gleaming even in daylight. There was no shouting, no chaos, just efficiency, relentless and precise. Obergefreiter Johann Weber, a former machinist from the Ruhr, could only stare. In his secret diary he wrote, "Each crane does the work of 20 men, and there are hundreds of them. No smoke, no steam, everything electric. We believed they were decadent lazy. But their machines work while men sleep." He counted 47 cargo ships at berth that morning. Each one seemed alive, unloading mountains of goods, trucks, tanks, ammunition, aircraft parts, while others reloaded with food and raw materials bound for Europe. To the prisoners, it was as if America's coastline itself had become an assembly line. The guards offered no explanations. They didn't need to. The sight spoke for itself. From the harbor, the prisoners marched to the waiting trains, and there the next revelation awaited them. They had expected freight wagons, the 40 and 8 cars used to haul troops and livestock across Europe. Instead, they found Pullman coaches with upholstered seats, polished brass fittings, and shaded lamps. Dining cars gleamed with white linen and silver cutlery. Observation cars offered panoramic windows. "We boarded like tourists," recalled Hauptmann Friedrich Radke, not prisoners. The guards seemed almost embarrassed. One sergeant even apologized that the air conditioning wasn't working properly, an apology that to the prisoners felt absurd. In Germany, such technology existed only for the Reich's elite. As the train pulled away, the Germans pressed their faces to the glass. Outside, America unfolded like a dream painted in light. The train wound through Virginia's countryside, rolling hills, endless farmland, and small towns glowing against the night. Every farmhouse, every diner, every filling station shimmered with electric brilliance. It was a sight impossible under the blackouts of wartime Europe. Gefreiter Hans Müller, the son of a Hamburg party official, wrote to his mother months later, "We passed through dozens of towns that first night. Each had more electricity than all of Hamburg. The guard said every home in America had power since the 1920s. I called him a liar. He just laughed and said, 'Wait until Texas.'" In Roanoke, the train stopped briefly to take on water. What they witnessed in that half-hour stop seared itself into their minds. Automated coal loaders emptied entire hoppers in minutes. Electric pumps refilled the locomotive's tanks without a single man breaking a sweat. Railway workers in clean overalls moved with casual ease, smoking cigarettes and drinking Coca-Cola from glass bottles. To the German eye, this was wealth bordering on the divine. Even the workers' boots, fine leather, well-stitched, would have cost a month's wages back home. By the time the trains crossed into Tennessee, disbelief had turned to silence. Electrical engineer Feldwebel Hinrich Müller began estimating power consumption as the train passed through each industrial yard. His notes preserved after the war still astonish historians. "This railway yard alone," he calculated, "uses more electricity in 1 hour than my entire Berlin district uses in a day." He called it the carelessness of infinite resource. Lights burned in empty buildings. Fans whirred in vacant rooms. Refrigerators, still a rarity in German homes, were visible through open windows in passing towns. For the men who had been told the United States was a collapsing capitalist shell, the experience bordered on the metaphysical. They were not just seeing another nation. They were seeing another world. When the trains entered Kentucky and the American Midwest, the full scale of the country's industrial ecosystem revealed itself. Through the wide windows, they saw factories stretching to the horizon, their smokestacks glowing red against the morning haze. Conveyor belts fed endless assembly lines. Parking lots brimmed with hundreds of cars belonging to ordinary workers, not generals or party elites. Near Louisville, the prisoners passed the Rubbertown complex, a cluster of synthetic rubber plants that had risen from empty farmland in barely 18 months. Oberleutnant Erich Hoffmann, a chemist from IG Farben, recognized the equipment instantly: distillation towers, catalytic crackers, chemical columns, each one larger than anything in Germany. There were 4 of them, he wrote after the war, each plant more advanced than our best facility at Lona, and they told us there were dozens more across the country. Hoffman understood immediately what this meant. Germany had lost the war of materials long before losing the war of weapons. The prisoners whispered among themselves as the train rolled on. Germany had invented synthetic rubber buna, but America had perfected it. The U.S. produced 800,000 tons annually, 6 times Germany's output at its peak, and it had done so in less than 2 years. To men trained to worship technological supremacy, it was like watching their gods die. Hours later, the train slowed again, this time outside Detroit. Through the windows loomed the colossal form of the Willow Run plant, Ford's legendary aircraft factory. It stretched for nearly a mile along the horizon, a geometric expanse of steel and glass covering more than 2 million square feet. This was the factory that built a B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. At peak production, 42,000 workers, men and women, assembled aircraft from 1.5 million individual parts. Even from the train, the prisoners could see rows of bombers gleaming under floodlights, their wings rising from the assembly line like mechanical birds. Lieutenant Karl Verli, a Luftwaffe pilot, shot down over Tunisia, stared out the window in stunned silence. We had been told American planes were poorly built, made by amateurs unfit for real war. But I saw their assembly lines, the precision, the speed, and I knew our factories were toys by comparison. In that moment, the myth of German superiority crumbled. The prisoners had entered captivity, believing they had been defeated by luck, by numbers, by geography. But the truth unfolding outside their train windows was more devastating. They had been defeated by capacity, by a civilization that could build faster, feed more, and waste more than any empire in history. By the time the train reached St. Louis, the Mississippi shimmered beneath them, its waters thick with commerce. Barges loaded with grain oil and steel moved in endless lines beneath the bridge. One Bavarian farmer among the prisoners, Carl Schmidt, wrote later, "We watched a single barge being filled with wheat enough to feed my village for 5 years. The crane operator ate a sandwich with meat thicker than our weekly ration." It was a moment of almost religious revelation. For these men raised on the gospel of Aryan superiority, this abundance was not just material, it was moral. They began to suspect that what they were seeing was not decadence, but the true face of strength. The journey westward would continue for 3 more days, deeper into the land of electric light and infinite motion. Each mile stripped another layer from their illusions. When they finally reached the camps in Texas, the demolition of Nazi ideology was complete. But the story of how that transformation deepened, how prisoners came to question everything they believed, was only beginning, because what awaited them behind the barbed wire was not punishment, but proof that freedom could produce more than tyranny ever could. The trains rolled south for 3 days, through a continent that seemed to have no end. From the steel arteries of the Midwest to the golden fields of Kansas, the prisoners of the Africa Corps watched an America that could not exist, not according to everything they had been told. Each sunrise revealed a new contradiction. In Germany, entire cities were rationing bread and coal. Here they passed towns with grocery stores overflowing with produce fields, shimmering with grain, and highways lined with billboards advertising tires, refrigerators, radios, luxuries that even Nazi officials could scarcely obtain. At every stop, railway workers performed miracles of speed and precision. Locomotives were refueled, lubricated, and turned around in less than half an hour. To the Germans raised on the cult of efficiency, this was perfection, but performed without the fear or fanaticism that governed their own system. Unteroffizier Wilhelm Hoffmann, a mechanical engineer from Hamburg, noted in his diary, "In Germany we call ourselves the masters of order. But these Americans, they do not need orders. Their order is natural, born of abundance, not command." As the trains crossed the Mississippi at St. Louis, the river itself became a symbol of America's scale. From the bridge, They saw a procession of barges so vast that it seemed endless. Each was heaped with grain, coal, or steel materials Germany could no longer dream of. Feldwebel Karl Schmidt, a farmer's son from Bavaria, counted the grain elevators along the banks. Each tower, he calculated, held enough wheat to feed a city. "The Americans transport food as we transport ammunition," he wrote, "without worry, without fear of loss." Below, cranes swung lazily in the sun, filling a single barge with enough grain to feed his entire village for 5 years. The crane operator, shirtless in the summer heat, ate a sandwich with meat thicker than the bread itself and tossed the rest into the water when he was done. For Schmidt, that image was unbearable. It was not cruelty. It was indifference born of plenty. The German concept of strength had always been rooted in deprivation, that suffering forged greatness, that scarcity made men strong. Yet here was a society that had built power on comfort order and effortless production. It was an inversion of everything Nazism stood for. When the trains reached Kansas City, the transformation deepened. Outside the station stretched stockyards filled with thousands of cattle, a living ocean of food. The prisoners could smell the meatpacking plants miles away. Gefreiter Paul Fischer, a former shopkeeper from Dresden, wrote home, "They eat meat like we eat bread." No, that is wrong. They eat meat as we wish we could eat bread. He described the scene of American dock workers on break eating thick hamburgers from street vendors. One guard bought 20 for the German prisoners, paying a single $1. For men whose rations in Africa had been 200 grams of meat per week, the experience was not just hunger, it was revelation. They began to realize that the enemy's power did not come from cruelty or conquest, but from organization and faith in production itself. When the trains finally reached Texas, the prisoners expected misery. But the camps that awaited them, built in only 4 months, defied imagination. Camp Hearn, near the small town of Hearn, was more like a university campus than a prison. It housed nearly 5,000 men in wooden barracks, equipped with electric lights running water and flush toilets. The bathrooms alone left the prisoners speechless. In Germany, even many middle-class families lacked such comfort. "We were housed better than civilians in the Reich," one prisoner later wrote. For officers and medical personnel, the shock was even greater. The camp hospital was fully equipped with X-ray machines, operating theaters, and supplies that German doctors hadn't seen in years. Oberstleutnant Dr. Friedrich Bauer, chief surgeon of the 164th Light Division, recorded his astonishment. They used penicillin on minor infections, a miracle drug we had only heard whispers about. In Germany, men were dying for lack of sulfur powder. Here, our enemies used their best medicine on us, without hesitation. That moment shattered another illusion. Nazi propaganda had taught that democracy was weak, too sentimental, too divided, too restrained by morality to win wars. Yet here was a democracy so confident in its power that it could treat its enemies with humanity, and that humanity cut deeper than any weapon. Inside the camp kitchens, prisoners assigned to cooking duty discovered what abundance truly meant. Walk-in refrigerators lined with fresh milk and butter, gas ranges the size of cars, electric mixers, automated dishwashers, industrial ovens capable of feeding 5,000 men. Feldwebel Otto Krebs, once a hotel chef in Munich, wrote in disbelief, "We threw away more food today than my family has seen in 3 years. Not spoiled food, simply surplus. Regulations require 10% extra be cooked. The excess is discarded." I wept as I threw good bread into the garbage. To a German raised under ration cards and slogans of sacrifice, this waste was not a moral failure, it was a revelation of unimaginable wealth. For the first time, prisoners began to argue not about whether America was powerful, but how such power was possible. By September 1943, the U.S. faced a severe labor shortage as millions of men served overseas. The War Department decided to use German POWs as laborers on farms and in factories. It was a pragmatic decision, but it would also become one of the most effective psychological weapons of the war. Each day, trucks carried groups of prisoners into the American countryside. No blindfolds, no secrecy. The men were allowed to see everything. They saw fields that stretched to the horizon, tractors working through the night under electric floodlights and silos taller than church steeples. Unteroffizier Herbert Lang, a farmer from Württemberg, was assigned to a cotton gin outside Houston. What he witnessed destroyed the last vestiges of Nazi arrogance. A single machine processed more cotton in an hour than my entire village could in a month, he wrote. The farmer was no noble, no party member, just an ordinary man. Yet he had electricity, running water, a car, a truck, a tractor. Even his workers ate more than German officers. For Lang, it was more than humiliation, it was conversion. We believed we were the master race, he reflected years later. But they were the masters of technology, of industry, of civilization itself. As the trucks carried them back to camp at dusk, the Germans watched the Texas sky glow with 1,000 lights from farms and towns, a quiet constellation of prosperity stretching to the horizon. It was a view no Nazi officer could explain, no ideology could contain, because this was not propaganda. This was America, a nation at war, yet still rich enough to waste, strong enough to share, and secure enough to treat its enemies as human beings. And that, more than any battle, was the weapon that broke them. By early October 1943, the prisoners' daily journeys into the American heartland had become routine, but what they saw never stopped astonishing them. Each sunrise revealed a landscape of machines and motion, a civilization that seemed to run on pure energy. Outside Lincoln, Nebraska, a group of POWs assigned to sugar beet fields watched as a single combine harvester moved methodically across the land. The machine gleamed in the morning light, its gears whirring, its engine purring like a symphony of precision. Unteroffizier Wilhelm Hoffmann, the same engineer who had once designed mechanical components for Krupp in Essen, could not look away. That one machine, he noted, does the work of 100 men, and the boy driving at 16, maybe 17, smokes a cigarette while he works. We built tanks to conquer the world, and they built this to feed it. The young American farmer waved as the Germans watched. His tractor was worth more than Hoffmann's family home. When Hoffmann asked through a guard how such a boy could afford such a thing, the guard shrugged and said, "The bank lends it. He'll pay it off with next season's crop." That simple sentence cut deeper than propaganda ever could. In Nazi Germany, a peasant could labor for generations without owning his tools. In America, a teenager could own the future with credit and trust. The prisoners were beginning to understand that this abundance was not luck. It was systemic prosperity built on an economic model that rewarded productivity rather than ideology. That fall, as harvest season reached its peak, the German POWs became participants in America's wartime miracle. They picked cotton in Texas, sugar beets in Nebraska, and fruit in California. Everywhere they went, they encountered the same impossible truth: America was not starving under war. It was thriving through it. Gefreiter Franz Weber, a farmer from East Prussia, wrote in his secret journal, "One American farmer with machinery produces more food than 100 of ours." They showed us photographs, thousands of square miles of wheat. They could lose half their harvest and still feed the world. In Kansas, Weber worked beside American farmers who treated him not as an enemy, but as another pair of hands. They shared their lunches, sandwiches, thick with meat, cold milk from Thermos's apples, so fresh they seemed unreal. They spoke of the war like weather, Weber wrote. Distant, inevitable, but not frightening. They were calm, confident, as if victory was not something to be won, but something already built. The realization was spreading among the prisoners like an infection. This was a country not mobilized by fear or ideology, but by competence, a democracy that had industrialized itself into invincibility. Meanwhile, across the U.S., factories roared without pause. Even the prisoners who never saw them could feel the hum of that machine in the distance. Those who did, men sent to work in non-military industries, witnessed what historians now describe as one of the greatest production surges in human history. In New Jersey, a group of POWs assigned to a Campbell's soup factory watched in awe as conveyor belts moved like rivers of automation. Stabsfeldwebel Ernst Wagner, who had managed a small food plant in Düsseldorf before the war, recorded the experience for his family. Everything was electric automatic. Steam cookers processed hundreds of cans at once. A woman old enough to be my mother controlled machines that replaced 50 workers. She did this while drinking coffee and listening to music. They joked while working, yet produced more in one day than we did in a month. What struck Wagner most wasn't just efficiency, it was ease. In Nazi Germany, production was achieved through discipline, shouting, and fear. In America, it was achieved through confidence, coordination, and faith in the system. Everywhere, the same paradox repeated itself. Workers without fear were more productive than workers under tyranny. Near Detroit, another group of prisoners worked unloading coal at a power station. Across the river, they could see the sprawling silhouette of the Ford River Rouge complex, an industrial empire in steel and smoke. The plant consumed 1.5 million kilowatt-hours of electricity each day, more than all of Hamburg. Within its walls, 100,000 workers built engines, jeeps, and tanks at a speed that defied comprehension. Obergefreiter Franz Kellner, a former mechanic from Bremen, described what he saw. Thousands of cars stood in the workers' lot. Not officers, not generals, workers. The guard said many had 2 cars, one for work, one for family. We thought he mocked us. But it was true. In that instant, the myth of Nazi people's prosperity collapsed completely. The Volkswagen, the people's car promised by Hitler in 1934, had been a lie. Fewer than 1,000 had ever reached civilian hands before the war. In America, even factory welders drove their own cars. The contrast was unbearable and transformative. By winter 1943, American intelligence officers monitoring POW morale began reporting a strange phenomenon. The Germans were not attempting escape. They were asking questions. Major Paul Newland of the Provost Marshal General's office wrote in his December report, "The prisoners no longer argue when shown production statistics. They have seen too much. The most fanatical among them are silent now. Their arrogance has evaporated." In the camp, newspapers printed by the prisoners themselves under American supervision, subtle changes appeared. Early editions were full of defiance and nostalgia for the Reich. By December, editorials began discussing democracy economics and the moral implications of industrial organization. At Camp Kearney in Rhode Island, the German-language paper Der Ruf published an article titled, "Where Does Strength Come From?" The answer, written by a former Wehrmacht lieutenant, was simple. Not from fear, from work freely given, from respect for every man who contributes. It was the kind of statement that would have been treason in Germany, and yet here, behind barbed wire in the heart of Texas democracy, was quietly winning its most improbable victory, not through leaflets or speeches, but through example. What began as shock was becoming curiosity. Prisoners requested books, newspapers, dictionaries. They asked to learn English. By the end of 1943, over 10,000 German POWs were enrolled in educational programs. Many requested to study American government economics and law. Lieutenant Hermann Goetz, captured with the 10th Panzer Division, summed up the growing realization in a censored letter home. "We were told America was a mongrel nation, weak, divided, controlled by Jews, incapable of greatness. Yet every day here, I see the opposite. This is the most powerful, organized, and united nation on earth. We were deceived by criminals. The truth was no longer ideological. It was empirical. Every light bulb, every tractor, every meal, all of it formed a relentless argument. Nazism had built its empire on fear. America had built its own on faith in productivity, in cooperation in the ordinary citizen. And that faith the prisoners were beginning to understand was stronger than any army. Winter settled across the American South, and with it came a silence in the camps, not from cold, but from contemplation. By December 1943, many German prisoners had been working in the United States for nearly 6 months. The initial disbelief had faded. What replaced it was something deeper, quieter, and far more dangerous to Nazi ideology understanding. Inside Camp Hearn, Texas, the guards decorated the barracks with tinsel and pine branches for Christmas. The air smelled faintly of roasted meat and cinnamon scents that would have felt impossible in Germany's war-starved winters. Local women from nearby towns sent baked goods and handmade cards to the prisoners. The Methodist church choir came to sing Silent Night in German. The gesture was not propaganda. It was humanity uncalculated and sincere. Feldwebel Hans Adler, a veteran of Rommel's Afrika Korps, later described that night in his memoir, "They were our enemies, and yet they sang for us." When they finished, the guard captain stood before us and said, "Tonight you are far from home, but you are not forgotten. May God watch over all sons at war." We cried, not from shame, but from confusion. We had been told the Americans were soulless materialists, but here they showed us grace. That Christmas, 500,000 packages, cigarettes, candy, soap, playing cards were distributed to German prisoners across the country. None were required by the Geneva Convention. They were given because Americans wanted to give them. To the prisoners, this was incomprehensible. Their own army under Hitler had executed or starved millions of Soviet captives. Yet here, their enemy not only fed them, but celebrated with them. Oberleutnant Walter Müller, whose brother had died in the bombing of Hamburg, wrote that the experience destroyed every remnant of what we had been taught about democracy. They know we are their enemies, yet they treat us with kindness. Only a nation utterly certain of its strength behaves this way. The Christmas meal itself became a symbol of that strength. Each camp served turkey ham, mashed potatoes, gravy vegetables, pie, and ice cream. The Germans ate until they could eat no more. For many, it was their first full meal since before the war began. Gefreiter Hans Meyer, a Bavarian infantryman, wrote home in disbelief, "If they feed us like this, what must their soldiers eat? What must their civilians have? We thought our propaganda exaggerated American wealth. It did not exaggerate enough." That night, the prisoners lay awake staring at the electric lights strung across the camp's perimeter fence, a sight both comforting and surreal. They were captives, yes, but also witnesses to something larger, the power of a nation that didn't just win wars, but won minds. By January 1944, the U.S. military began formalizing this psychological transformation into what historians would later call the Special Projects Division, a secret re-education initiative run under the office of the Provost Marshal General. Its mission was simple: to teach democracy through exposure, not indoctrination. Unlike Nazi political instruction, the program didn't rely on slogans or lectures. It relied on evidence libraries, newspapers, films, and open discussion. The prisoners had already seen America's physical power. Now, they would see its intellectual one. Educational programs expanded rapidly. By spring 1944, over 40,000 prisoners were enrolled in classes on English, mathematics, economics, and American history. Professors from Stanford, Harvard, and the University of Chicago volunteered to teach correspondence courses inside the camps. Dr. Wilhelm von Braun, a physicist conscripted from the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, recalled in a 1950 interview, "They taught us not propaganda, but science, atomic physics, engineering, philosophy." Jewish professors who had fled Germany taught us without hatred. That broke something inside us. We saw that intelligence and compassion could coexist. It was an inversion of everything the Third Reich had stood for, a refutation, written not on leaflets, but in kindness. At Camp Shelby, Mississippi, the camp theater began screening American films Gone with the Wind, The Grapes of Wrath. Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. The prisoners watched with fascination. For the first time, they saw a nation willing to criticize itself publicly, to show corruption, poverty, and failure, yet remain unshaken in its unity. Lieutenant Joseph Kromer wrote, "In Germany, such a film would mean prison or death. Here they call it patriotism. They show their flaws to make themselves better. That is strength." Soon, Der Ruf, the German-language newspaper edited by anti-Nazi prisoners, began publishing essays about democracy and the rule of law. The editors debated economic system civil rights and the moral failures of fascism. What had begun as a monitored project quickly turned into a genuine exchange of ideas. Prisoners started organizing discussion groups about rebuilding Germany after the war conversations unimaginable under Hitler's regime. As the months passed, the U.S. military realized that what was happening in these camps went far beyond containment. It was conversion. Major Henry Noland wrote in a classified report to Washington, "The ideological collapse of Nazi thought among POWs is nearly total. The combination of humane treatment exposure to abundance and educational opportunity has created spontaneous democratic sentiment. It is not forced, it is observed." By February 1944, camp libraries held more than 250,000 books. German prisoners devoured everything from Mark Twain and Steinbeck to the Federalist Papers. They debated in English, argued about capitalism, and even staged mock elections for camp leadership. For many, it was their first real experience of free speech. "We were free for the first time as prisoners," wrote Obergefreiter Rudolf Hartmann. "We could question authority without fear. We could disagree. It was terrifying and beautiful." In those same months as Europe drowned in blood, German soldiers across America were quietly rediscovering humanity. When news arrived of Allied bombings in Hamburg, Frankfurt, and Berlin, many feared reprisals from their guards. Instead, American officers delivered Red Cross telegrams with condolences and even offered chaplains for counseling. In one case at Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, the camp commander personally visited a grieving prisoner whose son had been killed on the Eastern Front. No father should bury his son, he told him, and sat in silence for 10 minutes. The gesture was small, but to men raised under a system that punished grief as weakness, it was revolutionary. "They treated our pain as human," one prisoner later said. "The Nazis treated it as a defect." By spring, America's quiet weapon mercy was achieving what bombs could not. The prisoners had arrived in disbelief, survived in astonishment, and were now beginning to admire. They had been told democracy was weakness. They were discovering that democracy was confidence. And with every class, every conversation, and every act of kindness, another soldier of the Third Reich laid down, not just his arms, but his convictions. The battle for their minds was almost over, and America was winning it without firing a shot. By the spring of 1944, America's experiment in humane captivity had become one of the most successful psychological operations of the war. What had begun as a pragmatic solution to the labor shortage was now reshaping the identities of thousands of men who had once sworn loyalty to Hitler. Across hundreds of camps from California to the Carolinas, the German prisoners were no longer simply detainees. They had become students, workers, and witnesses to a civilization that seemed to defy every law of wartime scarcity. Inside the classroom tents of Camp Swift, Texas, Lieutenant Kurt Weber stood before a blackboard filled with English words and simple arithmetic. 2 years earlier, he had commanded a platoon in Tunisia. Now he was explaining American vocabulary to his fellow officers. He paused and pointed to a phrase written on the board, "We the people." "They begin their constitution not with their leaders," he said quietly, "but with themselves." That sentence echoed long after class ended. For men conditioned to think of authority as divine, the concept of government born from the people was disorienting and irresistible. In canteens and barracks across the United States, German prisoners debated what freedom actually meant. They argued about capitalism, religion, and the future of Germany. But something fundamental was shifting. Even the most loyal Nazis were silent now. The war in Europe was turning decisively against the Reich, and with every newspaper headline Monte Cassino Anzio, the encirclement of Army Group North, it was harder to believe the myth of inevitable victory. Yet the Americans did not gloat. They handed out newspapers without censorship. They allowed the prisoners to read Allied and even critical editorials. Oberfeldwebel Heinrich Bauer later wrote, "We were free to know the truth while our families back home were still being fed lies." For many, the realization was unbearable. For others, it was liberating. When Italy surrendered in September 1943, the Americans had taken in tens of thousands of Italian POWs who volunteered to work in what were called Italian service units. These men were allowed more freedom, better rations, and even pay. To the Germans, this was shocking. They had treated Italian soldiers as traitors and cowards. Yet in America, these same Italians now worked alongside their former enemies, earning wages, eating in restaurants, even dating American women. Hauptmann Friedrich Schultz recorded the moment the illusion cracked completely. We had called them degenerates. But they were laughing free, well-fed, wearing clean uniforms. They had betrayed Mussolini, yet the Americans treated them with respect. I began to understand then, democracy punishes with justice, not hatred. This realization tore at the core of Nazi racial doctrine. The men who had been told that equality was weakness were watching it build the most powerful nation on earth. The Special Projects Division took careful note of this transformation. A classified 1944 report titled Ideological Collapse and Rehabilitation of German Prisoners observed, "It is no longer necessary to persuade most captives of the inefficiency of the Nazi system. Observation has done what instruction could not. They have seen the contrast between a society of fear and one of confidence." To solidify that insight, the camps launched what became known as the Democracy Curriculum, an unprecedented education program that blended civics, economics, and ethics. Prisoners studied the U.S. Constitution, the Federal Reserve System, labor rights, and the Bill of Rights. They read the Federalist Papers alongside translations of Plato and Kant. At Camp McCain in Mississippi, a visiting professor from the University of Chicago gave a lecture on the moral foundations of freedom. He told his audience, "Democracy is not chaos. It is trust made visible." The German officers sat in silence. They were used to obedience born of fear. This idea, obedience born of consent, felt like heresy. But the heresy was contagious. Outside the classroom, daily life continued at its comfortable, efficient rhythm. Farm trucks arrived at dawn to pick up labor details. At canning plants, prisoners worked side by side with Americans. In towns across the South, they became familiar figures in overalls and sun hats, Jerry the farmhand or the German boys. Local families began to see them not as enemies, but as young men far from home. Many offered food or conversation. Church groups brought lemonade during the hot days. Children asked them to help feed animals. At Camp Ruston, Louisiana, local farmers invited prisoners to Sunday dinners after church, a breach of regulations, but one often overlooked by sympathetic guards. Unteroffizier Karl Steiner, who attended one of these dinners, described it simply. "We sat at their table, ate their food, and talked of families. Their son was in Italy fighting us, yet they treated me like a guest. That meal defeated Nazism more completely than any tank. The kindness did not soften all of them immediately. Some prisoners resisted, insisting that American hospitality was merely another form of propaganda, but their arguments grew weaker with each passing month. For every claim of hypocrisy, there was a counterexample, a white farmer sharing a field with a black laborer, a female factory worker operating machinery equal to any man, a Jewish professor teaching German students about science. These realities shredded the racial hierarchy on which Nazism was built. Feldwebel Otto Meyer, once a Hitler youth instructor, later admitted, "We saw Negroes operating cranes, women driving trucks, Jews teaching physics, and it worked. The world we were told was impossible existed before our eyes." For the first time, equality was not an abstraction. It was functioning, tangible, and powerful. The American guards themselves played an understated but crucial role in this transformation. Most were citizen soldiers, farmers, teachers, mechanics, who treated their prisoners with quiet decency. Sergeant Daniel Pierce, a guard at Camp Hearn, wrote to his wife, "These boys are no monsters, just soldiers who fought for the wrong flag. I'd rather show them what America is than tell them." His approach became a model for the entire system. Guards were instructed not to humiliate or indoctrinate, but to maintain dignity. The idea was simple: let the prisoners experience freedom through discipline, not fear, and it worked. By the end of March 1944, disciplinary incidents had dropped by 70% across the camps. Escape attempts, never common to begin with, became almost non-existent. Instead, German POWs were volunteering for extra labor shifts, language classes, and even musical performances. In Camp Trinidad, Colorado, a full orchestra formed 50 musicians strong, performing Mozart and Beethoven for both prisoners and guards. The applause, mixed German and American, echoed across the Rockies that evening, a sound of reconciliation before the war had even ended. The psychological metamorphosis was nearly complete. These men had been trained to worship strength and despise mercy. But in America, they had found that mercy was strength. They had seen that a society without fear could produce more, fight harder, and live better than one built on terror. And quietly, within those electrified fences, the future of Germany was already being rewritten, not in decrees or propaganda, but in the minds of men who had come to understand that true power lies not in domination, but in creation. By mid-1944, the transformation of Germany's captured soldiers was no longer anecdotal, it was measurable. American intelligence officers monitoring morale reported that entire compounds were operating like small universities. In the same barracks where men had once raised their arms in salute to Hitler, now hung chalkboards filled with English vocabulary, arithmetic drills, and translated passages from Jefferson and Lincoln. At Camp McAllister in Oklahoma, morning roll call was followed by lectures on economics and agriculture. Prisoners who had been artillerymen or mechanics were learning about crop rotation, soil conservation, and business accounting. The purpose was practical, to prepare them for work in America's farms, but the effect was ideological. They were learning that wealth was a function of organization, not conquest. Unteroffizier Ernst Vogt, a farmer from Saxony, wrote in his notebook, "They do not fight nature, they cooperate with it. Their machines are their soldiers, their harvest, their victory." We believed strength came from sacrifice. They believe it comes from efficiency. Each lesson drew the prisoners further from the world they had known. The Nazi vision of destiny and racial hierarchy had no place here. America's creed, productivity through freedom, was not just theory. It was visible in every factory whistle and every full plate. Beyond the camps, the prisoners were still being used to sustain the home front. Millions of American men were overseas, so the labor shortage was desperate. German POWs filled the gap, picking cotton in Texas, harvesting sugar beets in the plains, and cutting timber in the Northwest. The Geneva Convention forbade their use in direct war production, but everything they touched fed the machine of victory indirectly. And everywhere they went, they encountered an economic ecosystem so vast and self-sustaining that it dwarfed anything they had imagined. At the Higgins Industries shipyard in New Orleans, prisoners unloading steel watched hundreds of workers, men and women, black and white, building landing craft for the D-Day invasion. They saw cranes lifting hull plates like sheets of paper, sparks raining down from welders who moved with ballet-like precision. The factory produced 700 boats per month, each one requiring 20,000 individual parts. Stabsfeldwebel Kurt Zimmermann, a former engineer from Bremen, described it. They work in 3 shifts, 24 hours a day. Women guide cranes the size of buildings. Boys, barely 18, run the welding torches. Negroes supervise teams of white men. It functions perfectly. We were told democracy created chaos. I see only harmony and thunder. For Zimmerman, that single day in New Orleans was more devastating to Nazi ideology than defeat in Tunisia. If this, he wrote, is what freedom looks like, then we have been prisoners since birth. Farther north at Republic Steel in Ohio, other groups of POWs witnessed the raw core of American industry. Blast furnaces glowed like miniature suns, the air trembling with heat. Endless trains delivered ore and coal. Molten rivers of metal poured into molds the size of tanks. The output was staggering 10,000 tons of steel every day. Obergefreiter Paul Hartmann, who had worked at Krupp before the war, was humbled. I thought I knew industry, but they waste more steel in spillage than we produced in our best months. Their workers argue with supervisors, yet the work never stops. They build through disagreement unimaginable to us. The observation cut to the heart of the American paradox. Freedom did not weaken discipline, it improved it. Initiative replaced fear. Responsibility replaced obedience. The system functioned not because it demanded submission, but because it trusted competence. It was a revelation that would linger long after the war. The same lesson echoed in the fields of the Midwest that summer. POWs working the wheat harvests of Kansas saw combines sweeping across horizons of gold. One machine harvested 100 acres a day. The grain elevators at the edge of the fields could hold more wheat than Germany imported in a year. Unteroffizier Franz Weber, who had grown up tilling stony Prussian soil by hand, wrote in awe, "They have conquered hunger the way we tried to conquer nations." One American farmer with his machines produces what 100 of us could not. The abundance bordered on the unreal. The farmers spoke casually of yields and prices that defied arithmetic. They treated the Germans with simple decency, giving them cold water, sometimes fresh fruit, occasionally a handshake. In those moments, the myth of the master race collapsed completely. The so-called inferior Democrats had built a paradise of work. The so-called superior Aryans were now laborers learning humility. Not all revelations came from wealth and industry. Some came from contradiction. The German soldiers were stunned to see black Americans in uniform guarding them, driving supply trucks and operating machinery. In Nazi ideology, such scenes would have been impossible. Yet here in America, even in a country still wrestling with segregation, the contradiction itself was proof of evolution. A flawed society could still improve openly, visibly, relentlessly. Oberfeldwebel Otto Müller noted in his diary, "We mocked them as a mixed race, but perhaps that mixture is their strength. They use everyone. They waste no hands." For a people raised on exclusion, the sight of inclusion was more disarming than any defeat. That summer, as wheat turned to gold and steel to fire news from Europe reached the camps. The Allied landings in Normandy, 6,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, shook even the most hardened POWs. They watched newsreels of the invasion at the camp theaters silent as the beaches filled with men and machines beyond imagination. One prisoner whispered to another, "We thought we had seen the future once in Berlin. We were wrong. The future is here." The scale of America's logistics rendered German pride meaningless. The Normandy operation was not a triumph of strategy, but of capacity, a feat only a country with endless resources and organization could attempt. Hauptmann Friedrich von Tauben later recalled, "We realized then that we had challenged a factory, not an army. They produced victory as they produced everything by the ton by the hour without emotion. In camp after camp, disbelief hardened into recognition. These men, once conquerors, were now witnesses to a civilization of builders. Every locomotive that passed every light left burning, every refrigerator humming in a farmhouse was a quiet sermon in democracy's strength. It taught a simple, devastating truth. Tyranny could mobilize hate, but freedom could mobilize everything else. The prisoners no longer looked west with contempt. They looked with curiosity and increasingly with respect. For many, America had ceased to be the enemy. It had become the model. By the autumn of 1944, the war in Europe was reaching its final brutal crescendo. But inside the American prison camps, an entirely different kind of revolution was unfolding. The men who had once marched beneath swastikas were now discussing democracy, economics, and human rights. They had entered captivity as warriors and were becoming students, not through coercion, but through awakening. The Special Projects Division documented the shift with astonishment. A classified report titled Ideological Transition, German POWs in the United States, dated September 1944, observed, "The transformation is not the product of deliberate re-education. It is the inevitable result of exposure to a functioning free society. The prisoners have ceased to view abundance as propaganda. They now see it as the natural consequence of liberty." The data supported the conclusion. Out of more than 350,000 German POWs held in America, fewer than 1% attempted escape. Fewer still caused discipline problems. In camp after camp, morale was high, cooperation near universal. Guards reported that many prisoners expressed reluctance to return to Germany not out of fear, but because they had glimpsed a better world. One such prisoner, Oberfeldwebel Heinrich Bauer, confessed in an interview, "I do not dream of escape. To what would I escape? Hunger ruins. Lies here I am fed, taught, and treated as a man. In Germany I was a tool. Here I am, a human being." At Camp Herne, a group of former officers established what they called Die Lageruniversität, the Camp University. They created lectures in philosophy, physics, engineering, and agriculture, all organized by the prisoners themselves. American officials approved it, even supplying blackboards, paper, and textbooks. Attendance was voluntary, yet nearly everyone came. They debated Plato and Goethe, the Federalist Papers, and the writings of Thomas Paine. They studied how the U.S. Constitution distributed power and ensured accountability, how its economy rewarded innovation rather than loyalty. Hauptmann Friedrich Rodke, who had once commanded tanks in North Africa, later recalled, "For the first time, I understood that our defeat was inevitable, not because the Americans had more weapons, but because they had more ideas." The intellectual collapse of Nazism had begun not on the battlefield, but in these makeshift classrooms. Meanwhile, the American countryside continued to astonish those who worked within it. POWs assigned to fruit orchards in California's Central Valley wrote letters home describing scenes that bordered on surreal. Obergefreiter Otto Schultz remembered standing among endless rows of orange trees, heavy with fruit, the air thick with sweetness. Yet much of that fruit, he discovered, would be thrown away, plowed back into the soil, or buried in pits to maintain market prices. "They destroy food to keep the price stable," he wrote in disbelief. "We begged to send it to Germany. They refused not from cruelty, but from indifference. They could afford to waste what we could not imagine possessing." To a generation raised on scarcity, this was not greed, it was sorcery. The industrialized abundance of the United States defied every moral and economic law the Nazis had preached. It was proof that efficiency and humanity could coexist, that freedom could outproduce tyranny. That same autumn, German prisoners began to notice another revelation, the power of inclusion. In American fields and factories, they worked alongside women. African Americans and immigrants groups Nazi propaganda had portrayed as inferior or degenerate. Yet here they were managing machinery, supervising crews, and working with confidence. Stabsfeldwebel Karl Hoffmann wrote in a letter seized by censors, "We mocked them as mongrels, but they are the future. Their strength comes from mixture. They draw from all races, all talents, and all minds. That is why they win." For some prisoners, it was their first encounter with true pluralism, and it shook them more profoundly than any defeat in battle. By Christmas 1944, the ideological cracks had become a chasm. In camp newspapers like Der Ruf, the Call editorials openly criticized Hitler's leadership and the moral decay of Nazism. One article titled, "The Lie We Lived," written by a former lieutenant from the Afrika Korps, declared, "We believed the state could replace God. We believed fear could replace freedom. We built monuments instead of homes, shouted slogans instead of truth, and called it strength. But here behind barbed wire, we have seen that decency and prosperity are not enemies, they are twins." American officials, astonished by the candor, allowed it to circulate. They understood that genuine conviction was more powerful than propaganda. Even the most stubborn ideologues were beginning to falter. Unteroffizier Gerhard Meissner, a die-hard Nazi who had once led political lectures for his unit, later admitted, "I stopped arguing when I realized I could not explain how a nation of shopkeepers had conquered us with tractors and typewriters." While minds were changing, America's own contradictions did not go unnoticed. The Germans saw segregated buses, whites-only signs, and racist incidents that undercut the democratic ideals they were learning. Some reacted with smug satisfaction, proof they thought that hypocrisy existed everywhere. But for others, it had the opposite effect. Lieutenant Hermann Goetz recorded his thoughts after witnessing a black soldier salute a white officer. "Yes, there is injustice here, but they speak of it openly. They debate it in newspapers. They protest it without disappearing in the night. That is the difference. Their flaws are wounds, not rot." The Germans had lived in a society where imperfection was denied, where dissent was treason. In America, imperfection was acknowledged and repairable. That they realized was the true genius of democracy, the ability to self-correct. As 1944 turned to 1945, the war in Europe was collapsing. The POWs read of Allied advances in the Ardennes, the fall of Aachen, the encirclement of the Ruhr. For many, the news brought despair. For others, a grim sense of relief. They had seen what America could build, and now they knew what Germany had destroyed. When photographs of liberated French towns arrived in Life magazine, the prisoners studied them in silence. Children smiling beside American tanks, bakeries reopening, women sweeping rubble from the streets. Life returning. Feldwebel Otto Meyer whispered to a friend, "They bring light wherever they go. We left darkness wherever we marched." It was not rhetoric, it was repentance. By spring 1945, American officials realized that the camps had accomplished something profound, a moral reconstruction before physical reconstruction had even begun. Tens of thousands of German POWs were no longer enemies. They were witnesses. Witnesses to the proof that democracy worked, that abundance was possible, that decency could prevail without terror. The United States had shown them a nation powerful enough to win by creation, not destruction. The realization was inescapable. The Reich had built fear. America had built factories. The Reich had promised destiny. America had delivered refrigerators, schools, and freedom. And in the quiet of the Texas plains, under the soft hum of electric lights, the men who once believed they were chosen began to believe they had been wrong. April 1945. Across the ocean, the Third Reich was disintegrating. Berlin was encircled, the Allies closing from every direction. In the American heartland, behind barbed wire and watchtowers that now felt almost symbolic, tens of thousands of German prisoners followed the news in stunned silence. They had spent nearly 2 years immersed in a civilization that seemed the mirror opposite of everything they had been taught, a place where abundance was ordinary and mercy was policy. For them, the defeat of Germany was no longer a catastrophe. It was justice. At Camp Shelby, Mississippi, an American officer pinned a notice on the bulletin board, "President Roosevelt dead, April 12, 1945. A hush fell over the camp. Some guards cried openly. Others stood with heads bowed. The Germans watched bewildered. Their enemy had lost his leader, Yet instead of collapse, the nation moved forward without hesitation. The trains still ran. The factories still thundered. The lights stayed on. Oberfeldwebel Hans Kruger later recalled, "We expected chaos. In Germany, everything would have stopped. But America did not stop. It was like watching a great machine lose one bolt and continue turning perfectly." That moment revealed to them the invisible strength of democracy leadership built not on personality, but on institutions. A few weeks later came another headline that silenced the camp's concentration camps' liberated atrocities exposed. The prisoners crowded around bulletin boards to see the photos, skeletal survivors behind wire mass graves, piles of shoes and hair. At first, most refused to believe them. They insisted they were forgeries, Allied propaganda, but the evidence grew too vast to deny. American officers showed captured documents, testimony from liberated civilians, and eyewitness reports from U.S. soldiers who had entered Buchenwald and Dachau. For men who had considered themselves honorable soldiers, it was unbearable. Dr. Friedrich Bauer, the former army surgeon now working in the camp infirmary, collapsed after reading the report. "We called ourselves defenders of civilization," he wrote in his notebook. "Now I see that we were its destroyers." Letters to families in Germany grew shorter, more hesitant. Many stopped writing altogether. Others wrote confessions disguised as reflections. "We did not know. We did not want to know. Now we cannot unknow." The war had ended, but their moral reckoning had just begun. In the weeks that followed, the United States began preparing for repatriation. The War Department called it Operation Paper Return, a massive logistical effort to return nearly 400,000 German POWs to Europe. But before they left, the U.S. government did something extraordinary. Each prisoner received vocational training, reading materials, and a briefing on reconstruction. They were taught not merely how to return, but how to rebuild. At Camp Hearn, instructors lectured on democratic government and the principles of the upcoming Marshall Plan, even before it had a name. They explained how nations could recover through open markets, free labor, and education. Captain Robert C. Richardson of the Psychological Warfare Division told his students, "You have seen what free men can build. When you return home, remember, this was not a miracle. It was method." For the prisoners, those words felt like both a farewell and a commission. As spring turned to summer, the long process of sending men home began. Liberty ships that had once carried them to captivity were now bound for Europe, this time filled not with warriors, but with witnesses. Before departure, each man was issued clean clothes, a medical check, and a Red Cross parcel, coffee, soap, chocolate, cigarettes. They were photographed one last time. Some smiled awkwardly. Others stared into the lens as if confronting their own ghosts. Hauptmann Friedrich Radke, whose diary had recorded his awakening, wrote his final entry on the deck of the SS Carol Victory. "We came to America as soldiers of a master race. We leave as students of humanity. They conquered us with factories and forgiveness. We will never forget either." In the holds below, quiet conversations filled the night. "What will we find when we return?" one asked. "Ruins," another answered. "But maybe also redemption." They talked about the farms they had worked, the Americans who had treated them kindly, the books they had read. Some worried about being branded traitors by their families. Others dreamed of rebuilding Germany in the image of what they had seen, not America itself, but its spirit, efficiency, without cruelty, strength, without hate. The stars above the Atlantic glowed through the open portholes. For the first time, the horizon symbolized not defeat, but possibility. When they arrived in Europe, they found a continent unrecognizable. Cities flattened, railways twisted like ribbon bridges gone. Germany itself was a wasteland divided into zones of occupation. Yet the men who stepped off those ships carried something invisible, a blueprint. Obergefreiter Ernst Vogt remembered walking through the ruins of Bremen, his hometown reduced to dust. "I saw children playing among rubble, women clearing bricks. I told my brother, we will build it again, but this time without fear. And they did. Within a decade, the same men who had once picked cotton in Texas or welded steel in Louisiana were applying those lessons to Reconstruction. They restructured farms with American-style machinery, reformed labor unions, modernized schools, and demanded constitutional safeguards. Economists would later call it Wirtschaftswunder, the German economic miracle. But to those who had lived in the camps, it was simply the proof that prosperity could be taught. In 1955, 10 years after their release, a group of former POWs gathered in Bonn for a reunion. They raised toasts not to the Reich, but to democracy and to America. The room filled with laughter, nostalgia, and a few tears. Hans Wehe, who had once worked on a farm in Iowa, stood to speak. "We came to America as prisoners," he said, "and discovered we had been prisoners all our lives of lies, of hate, of fear. In those camps, we learned what freedom truly means. It is not permission. It is participation." The applause lasted minutes. Among them were future ambassadors, engineers, and teachers. They would shape the post-war order not through vengeance, but through understanding. Historians today recognize the program as one of the most successful acts of ideological transformation in modern history, a victory achieved without guns or coercion. It was psychological warfare by example, a campaign fought with light bulbs, tractors, and textbooks. Dr. Arnold Kramer, who later chronicled the experience, wrote, "America's greatest propaganda weapon was not its words, but its reality. Every hot meal, every electric switch, every decent gesture was proof that freedom works." By the time the last ship left for Europe in 1946, even the most hardened prisoners had to admit a truth they would carry for the rest of their lives. The United States had not merely defeated Nazi Germany, it had outgrown it. The arsenal of democracy had built not just victory, but vision. Summer 1946. The war was over, but its aftershocks rippled quietly across 2 continents. In Germany, cities lay in ruin, yet something invisible was stirring in the rubble, a belief that rebuilding was possible. In America, the last transport ships bearing German prisoners slipped out of Norfolk and New Orleans, bound for Bremen, Le Havre, and Hamburg. Their cargo was not armaments, but enlightenment. Each man returning home carried a memory, a fragment of the civilization that had undone him. They had seen a land where even the poor owned cars, where women built bombers, where factories operated around the clock without fear of air raids, where churches sang for their enemies, and where kindness was given without calculation. For many, these impressions would prove more enduring than any political doctrine. Feldwebel Otto Müller, who once marched under the swastika with fierce conviction, wrote upon arrival in Bremerhaven, "I have come back to a destroyed Germany, but my mind is built anew. The Americans conquered us by feeding us, by teaching us, by forgiving us. I once believed we were the future. Now I know we were the past." The occupation authorities soon realized that these men were different. They were disciplined, pragmatic, and astonishingly optimistic. When interviewed by Allied officers, many spoke of electricity, of agriculture, of organization. They didn't talk about revenge. They talked about refrigeration. Across the Atlantic, American policymakers quietly acknowledged that something extraordinary had occurred. The prisoner of war education program, initially designed to occupy idle minds, had become the first step of Germany's reconstruction. A 1946 War Department memo summarized it bluntly. The transformation of German prisoners demonstrates that exposure to democratic efficiency produces greater change than punishment or propaganda. The example of America has educated more effectively than any lecture. This principal education through observation would later guide the Marshall Plan, NATO's founding strategy, and even post-war Japanese reconstruction. It was the doctrine of victory through visibility. Meanwhile, back in Germany, the seeds planted behind barbed wire began to sprout. former prisoners organized cooperatives, rebuilt schools, and modernized agriculture. In Schleswig-Holstein, former POW Ernst Vogt led a local initiative to electrify rural farms using American designs. In Stuttgart, Rüdiger von Marr, once held at Camp Herne, joined the new German Foreign Office and later became West Germany's representative to the United Nations. In Bonn, Walter Hallstein, who had taught democracy classes inside Camp Concordia, Kansas, helped draft the founding treaties of the European Economic Community, the precursor to today's European Union. Their experiences had reshaped their vision of Europe itself. The new Germany would not seek domination. It would seek cooperation. The United States, for its part, drew quiet satisfaction from this unexpected victory. The men once called enemies had become emissaries of American ideals. In 1950, when the Korean War broke out, journalists interviewing German veterans noticed a strange phenomenon: sympathy for America. Not just respect for its power, but admiration for its principles. Hans Kroll, former POW turned diplomat, told Die Welt newspaper, "The Americans won because they believed in something bigger than victory. They believed in civilization itself." The statement became a headline across West Germany. Sie siegten durch Menschlichkeit. They conquered through humanity. The moral conversion that began in Texas fields and Oklahoma classrooms was now radiating outward into the reconstruction of an entire continent. Factories rebuilt under the Marshall Plan operated on the same model the POWs had admired: efficiency without tyranny, management through cooperation. Labor unions adopted American-style collective bargaining. Agricultural output surged as farmers imported tractors and irrigation systems inspired by what prisoners had seen in Iowa and Kansas. By the early 1950s, the German economic miracle had begun. Western analysts marveled at the speed of recovery, but few understood the quiet human foundation beneath it. Hundreds of thousands of former soldiers who had already learned years earlier how a free society organizes its strength. One American report from 1953 observed, "The re-education of German POWs has produced a post-war generation naturally aligned with Western democratic ideals. Their loyalty was not coerced, it was reasoned. They are immune to tyranny because they have lived in its absence." By 1985, 40 years after the war's end, the last survivors gathered once more, this time not in camps, but in Texas, where their journey had begun. The reunion held in Austin drew more than 500 former German prisoners and their American hosts. They were old men, now stooped, silver-haired, wearing suits instead of uniforms. But when they spoke, the years fell away. Dr. Hans Wehe, who had once labored on an Iowa farm, stood before the crowd and read from a prepared statement. "We came here as conquerors and left as converts. We arrived with arrogance and departed with gratitude. America showed us that true strength is not the power to destroy, but the power to build." The auditorium erupted in applause, Americans and Germans standing together, united not by memory of war, but by the triumph of understanding. Oberstleutnant Friedrich Schultz, who had written bitterly in 1943 about surrender, raised his glass to the crowd. "To our captors," he said, smiling, "who became our teachers." Historians would later call the German POW experience in America the silent miracle. It proved that compassion, when coupled with competence, could reshape the defeated more effectively than coercion ever could. No brainwashing, no indoctrination, only evidence illuminated by electric light served with bread and coffee and carried on the rails of a nation that never slept. The Americans had fought Nazism with bullets and won, but they had defeated Nazism as an idea through example. Every factory whistle, every full stomach, every gesture of decency had been a weapon in that invisible war, and it had achieved what millions of tons of bombs could not: the conversion of hearts. By the close of the century, the sons of those prisoners were working beside the sons of their former guards, in NATO command centers, in transatlantic universities, in corporations and partnerships that spanned oceans. The alliance that would shape the next 100 years was not forged in treaties alone. It was born in the quiet dignity of the prison camps of 1943. And so, in the ledger of history, the story of the German POWs in America stands as a testament to the most paradoxical truth of war, that sometimes victory is measured not in enemies destroyed, but in enemies transformed. Their journey began with disbelief at the sight of lights blazing across the Texas plains, and ended with faith that freedom could feed, build, and heal where tyranny could only consume. They had arrived as soldiers of a fallen empire. They departed as witnesses to a new one, not an empire of conquest, but of creation.